And he'd taken me to see several Stone concerts here in the garden.
Well, yes, I've been there.
Everyone assumed Lee Radziwill lived a life of glamour but not fortune. In the final weeks of her life, whispers circulated about her financial struggles. Jewelry sales, tight budgets, a family convinced she was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Yet 5 weeks after her death in February 2019, the truth emerged like a thunderclap. Lee had secretly amassed a $50 million fortune, hidden from everyone she knew. Lawyers revealed a startling detail. She had rewritten her will just months before passing, choosing an heir in a move that stunned even the most seasoned family observers. This wasn't merely a matter of money. It was the culmination of decades of family rivalry, a continuation of a feud that began with her sister, Jacqueline Kennedy, the incomparable First Lady. Lee's choices, her spending, her alliances, all of it was carefully choreographed in a life that seemed effortless, but was, in reality, a complex game of influence, status, and subtle rebellion. The story of Lee Radziwill is not just about wealth or titles. It is a tale of appearances and secrets, of luxury built on borrowed fortunes, and of a woman who knew exactly how to navigate the treacherous waters of high society. She was Caroline Lee Bouvier, born into an environment where charm often mattered, more than cash, and where every gesture, every social maneuver was scrutinized by an eager public. From the moment of her birth, Lee's life was destined for spectacle, a stage on which she would act out her ambitions, desires, and rivalries. By the time she died, Lee had outmaneuvered expectations once again. She left behind not only a fortune, but a carefully constructed legacy, a final silent statement that her life was hers to command, unbound by the judgments or assumptions of the world around her. Her story is one of contrasts, opulence and secrecy, admiration and envy, public appearances and private intrigues. To understand her is to understand a woman who could walk into a room and command attention, yet hide a lifetime of strategy behind a smile. And it all began in Manhattan, in 1933, in a hospital that catered to the wealthiest families of New York, where the first act of her life already hinted at the drama, ambition, and complexity to come. Caroline Lee Bouvier was born on March 30, 1933, at Doctors Hospital in Manhattan, a place known for catering to the wealthiest families in New York. Even in a setting designed for the elite, her arrival caused a stir. Her father, John Blackjack Bouvier, was a Wall Street broker with more bravado than liquidity. On the day of her birth, he walked into the hospital wearing a camel hair coat he could hardly afford and distributed inexpensive cigars to the nurses, a small gesture of ostentation that encapsulated his life of borrowed glamour. Blackjack was determined that his daughter's birth would be more than a personal joy. It had to be a social event worthy of the Bouvier name. He demanded that the New York Times publish the announcement, a move that cost $16 at the time, roughly $350 today. But the theatrics did not end there. He sent out 48 meticulously crafted birth announcements on Tiffany stationery, stamped with a gold family crest he claimed had noble origins. In truth, the crest was purchased for $451 from a Manhattan shop, a symbol of status without legitimacy. By the evening, the news had spread along Park Avenue. The Bouvier now had 2 daughters who would turn heads for both beauty and money. Jacqueline, 4 at the time, was already called the Incomparable, and now Lee had arrived, a new jewel in the Bouvier crown. The public may have seen only the glamour, but behind the curtains, the family's reality was far less stable. Lee's father quickly gained notoriety, but not for achievements or wealth. Between 1935 and 1939, private detectives documented 23 extramarital affairs involving showgirls, married socialites, and women from Brooklyn's elite circles. He boasted that he could drink a quart of scotch and still have the charm to woo a woman by midnight, a braggadocio that would shape Lee's own ideas about men and relationships. The young Lee observed a world of chaos disguised as luxury. At 7, she overheard her mother crying after discovering a pawn ticket for Blackjack's sapphire cufflinks, which he had traded to fund a secret trip to Havana with a showgirl. Her nannies, who seemed more like chroniclers of a fairy tale, recounted the escapades of her father as though they were lessons in strategy, charm, and survival. These early experiences imprinted on Lee a belief that appearance often mattered more than reality, that charm could open doors that money could not, and that life's rules were flexible for those with audacity. Even as a child, Lee displayed a sense of poise and awareness unusual for her age. She learned quickly that social currency could be more valuable than financial stability. By her teenage years, she would embrace this worldview fully, gravitating toward men with wealth, titles, or reputations that carried a hint of danger. She confided to Truman Capote later in life, "Daddy taught me 2 things, champagne before noon and never expect fidelity." The lessons of her early childhood, both the allure and the cost of her father's choices, were embedded deeply, forming the foundation of a life that would be as glamorous as it was strategic. In this world of contrasts, contradictions, and crafted appearances, Lee's early life was set. Manhattan, with its polished streets, glittering society, and keenly observant neighbors, became the stage for a young girl who would learn to navigate the line between spectacle and reality, a skill that would define her entire life. From birth, she was being groomed not just to live, but to perform. Lee Radziwill's childhood was anything but ordinary. Surrounded by the glitter of Manhattan society, she witnessed a world that combined opulence with chaos. Her father, Blackjack Bouvier, was a master of appearances, yet his life was riddled with instability, secret escapades, and public scandals. By the time Lee was 7, she had already observed the duality of wealth and deception, luxury built on borrowed money, charm masking irresponsibility, and attention commanded as much by audacity as by accomplishment. The young Lee's days were filled with nannies who doubled as storytellers. They spun tales of her father's exploits, affairs with showgirls, married socialites, and society women who walked the same polished streets Lee would later navigate herself. To a child, these stories were both frightening and intoxicating. They revealed a world in which rules were flexible, charm was currency, and reputation could be as carefully constructed as a gown or a social invitation. Lee internalized these lessons early, learning that observation, discretion, and grace could be tools as powerful as wealth. Her father's audacity left a lasting imprint. Once, after discovering that he had pawned a pair of sapphire cufflinks to fund a secret trip to Havana, Lee found her mother in tears. From that moment, she understood that appearances were fragile and fleeting, yet could always be manipulated to suit one's desires. These early episodes shaped her fascination with men of power, allure, and unpredictability. As she confided later to Truman Capote, her father had taught her champagne before noon and never expect fidelity, an aphorism that would inform both her romantic choices and her approach to society at large. School became another stage on which Lee learned the art of performance. At Miss Porter's school in Connecticut, she joined an elite cohort of girls groomed for marriage into European nobility. The curriculum emphasized decorum, etiquette, and the rituals of aristocratic life. Lee excelled in the decorative arts. She could name French cheeses by smell, execute flawless curtsies, and address members of royal families with practiced precision. Yet, classes in finance and money management eluded her. Where other girls learned to calculate budgets, Lee learned to orchestrate appearances, a skill that would later define her adult life. Social lessons were supplemented by scrupulous preparation for her public debut. Lee maintained scrapbooks of eligible bachelors, featuring European aristocrats such as the Duc de Brisac and the Earl of Daleth. These scrapbooks were not merely idle fantasies. They were training manuals for a life she was already beginning to live on stage. A life in which observation and strategy mattered as much as charm and beauty. At home, the Bouvier household was a study in contrasts. While the family presented itself as aristocratic and wealthy, the truth was often quite different. Blackjack's brokerage had suffered major losses during the Depression, and the family's wealth was largely fabricated or borrowed. Yet to Lee, the illusion of luxury was real enough. The pearls, the parties, the elegant dresses, and the constant performance of status. She absorbed these contradictions, learning to navigate a world in which appearances often mattered more than substance. By the end of her formative years, Lee had internalized the rules of her social universe. She was observant, poised, and highly aware of the power of image. She understood that charm, audacity, and meticulous presentation could open doors and command attention, even in a world that valued wealth above all else. In every anecdote, every lesson, and every carefully curated appearance, the blueprint of Lee Radziwill's adult life was already taking shape. A life of glamour, strategy, and quiet rebellion, performed with elegance and precision. By the time Lee Radziwill reached her late teens, she was no longer just the younger sister of Jacqueline Kennedy. She was a social presence in her own right. Her public debut was a carefully choreographed spectacle, a stage upon which Lee's elegance, beauty, and poise would be measured against the best of New York society. On Christmas Day in 1950, Life magazine published a full-page feature on her, a photograph taken by the celebrated Milton H. Greene. Lee wore a white satin gown inspired by Dior, costing $900, adorned with over 400 pearls meticulously sewn into the fabric. The gown itself was a testament to the family's obsession with appearances and status. Lee's mother, Janet, ordered 2,000 prints of the photograph to send as holiday cards, the postage alone exceeding the rent of an average family for the month. Letters flooded in. Over 1,300 inquiries asked about the tiara, borrowed from Aunt Edith Beale, who would later become famous in Grey Gardens. The attention was extraordinary, given that nearly 2,000 debutantes had made their appearances across the United States that year. Privately, Life editors ranked Lee as #1 in photogenic appeal, an acknowledgement that reinforced her place at the apex of social visibility. Yet behind this gilded exterior, familial tensions simmered. Jacqueline, the older sister, could not help but feel a measure of unease. She reportedly told a friend, "The world crowned Cinderella before her stepsister even arrived at the ball." The nickname Lee itself was more than a casual shortening. It was a deliberate choice by her mother to preserve her maiden name in the press, ensuring that every social appearance would carry a touch of Bouvier's influence. At Miss Porter's school in Connecticut, Lee's education reinforced her future in the limelight. The school prepared wealthy girls for marriages into European nobility, charging $1,400 a year, triple the cost of an Ivy League semester. Lee excelled in the decorative arts of the French monarchy, mastering curtsies, formal dining etiquette, and the intricate protocols of European royalty. She failed classes that involved finance or money management, a foreshadowing of a life where style would always outweigh substance. Her classmates recalled her meticulous attention to detail, practicing curtsies in front of mirrors, timing dips with stopwatches, and keeping scrapbooks of eligible bachelors. Lee's interests leaned heavily toward European aristocrats, with names like the Duc de Brissac and the Earl of Dallas appearing prominently. By her graduation in 1951, Lee had mastered the rituals of upper-class society. She could set a formal table for 18 guests, identify 42 French cheeses by smell, and recite the proper forms of address for every royal family in Europe. To her mother, Janet, these accomplishments were a triumph. The Bouvier daughters would move through life with grace, elegance, and the social tools necessary to navigate a world of wealth, power, and influence. Despite the polish and preparation, Lee's world was still built on a foundation of appearances. The family's wealth was increasingly precarious, derived from rental properties, firewood, and timber, a far cry from the aristocratic image projected in Manhattan salons. Yet Lee thrived in the contrast between reality and perception, learning to perform wealth, charm, and sophistication with natural ease. She was now a young woman whose every gesture, outfit, and public appearance was not just fashion or decorum, it was a carefully honed instrument of social power. By the end of her teenage years, Lee Radziwill had achieved something few debutantes ever do. She had become her own story, separate from her family, yet inseparable from the societal stage on which she would continue to captivate the world. With her beauty, her poise, and her sharp instincts for social maneuvering, she was poised to enter a life where every step would be scrutinized, every move measured, and every audience enchanted. At just 20 years old, Lee Radziwill made a decision that would propel her fully into adult society. She married Michael Temple Canfield. The wedding, held on April 18, 1953, took place at her stepfather Hugh Auchincloss's estate and was rushed only 8 weeks after their engagement. The ceremony was attended by 700 guests, a glittering mix of New York elite, socialites, and society columnists, all eager to witness the union of two prominent families. Publicly, the marriage was hailed as a storybook romance, a perfect merging of charm, beauty, and social pedigree. Privately, however, Lee admitted she simply wanted to escape the confines of her home and the constant shadow of her sister Jackie. Her father, Blackjack, arrived at the wedding already inebriated. Jacqueline had to walk him through the gardens, keeping him from disrupting the event. Even the ceremony itself was hastened. There was no formal reception, and immediately after their vows, Lee and Michael boarded an evening flight to London. The speed and glamour of the event set the tone for Lee's adult life, swift, extravagant, and meticulously staged. Michael Canfield came from a respected publishing family, but whispers followed him everywhere. Rumors suggested that he might be more than just a Canfield. Some believed he was the secret son of Prince George, Duke of Kent, and Alice Preston, a glamorous American woman notorious for her drug use and tragic death in 1946. The Duke himself had died in a plane crash in 1942. Gossip added a layer of intrigue and royalty to Michael's name, giving him an aura that few men could claim. Even his second wife would later remark that the Duke of Windsor once stared at him across a lunch table and muttered, "I'm certain your husband is my brother's son." Despite the fairy tale veneer, Lee's family had serious reservations. Her stepfather warned quietly, he'll never be able to afford her, while her mother fretted over Michael's modest $9,000 salary, barely enough to maintain Lee's extravagant wardrobe and lifestyle. Jackie, ever observant, joked that Lee would need either a prince or a publisher with a vast fortune to sustain her habits. Lee, however, was undeterred. From the very first morning after the wedding, she sorted through her gifts with a meticulous eye, keeping some, returning others, and demanded fresh flowers when her bridal bouquet wilted, even at triple the cost. Her spending was not a temporary indulgence. It was a reflection of her personality, a signal that she would live life on her own terms. By 6 months into their marriage, the couple relocated to London. Michael accepted a modest job with Harper's Magazine, while Lee immersed herself in the city's social scene. She hosted over 40 dinner parties in a single year, joined exclusive clubs, and purchased 3 expensive gowns in 1 week, all charged to Michael's account at Harrods. She imported dogs and even an American-style refrigerator, paying customs fees equivalent to 4 months of Michael's salary. Friends and acquaintances whispered that he edited books by day to fund Lee's lifestyle by night. Lee's approach to society was deliberate and strategic. She once confided to Truman Capote that she preferred titles over fortunes, a reflection of her lifelong desire for recognition, status, and the trappings of aristocracy. By 1957, she was spending at least $8,000 annually on clothing, 6 times Michael's salary. The lavish lifestyle was not just vanity, it was her way of asserting control, crafting her image, and mastering the world she inhabited. Through her early marriage, Lee Radziwill demonstrated the traits that would define her life: extravagance, audacity, and an unerring sense of social strategy. Every party, every purchase, and every public appearance was part of a carefully orchestrated performance, one that ensured she would always remain in the spotlight, commanding attention and admiration wherever she went. By her mid-20s, Lee Radziwill had already mastered the art of social performance, yet the next chapter of her life would take her from the salons of London to the rarefied world of European nobility. Her second marriage, to Prince Stanisław Stas Radziwill, was not just a union of two people, it was a spectacle that captured the imagination of high society, newspapers, and the public alike. Their affair began discreetly, shadowed by scandal and intrigue. At the time, the prince was still married to a Swiss banking heiress, Grace Colin, whose social standing could rival Lee's own. The discovery of the affair was inevitable. In high society, nothing stays secret for long. Grace learned of Lee through the usual channels, gossip columns and social whispers, and promptly filed for divorce. The headlines spanned Europe, from Zurich to London, chronicling the dissolution of a marriage in which power, wealth, and status intersected in complex ways. Despite the scandal, Lee's rise was meteoric. Barely 4 months after her wedding, to Michael Canfield had ended in divorce, she walked into a London registry office wearing powder blue, her elegance unmistakable, poised, and already accustomed to commanding attention. By her side was Stanisław Radziwill, who himself carried the aura of nobility, scandal, and mystery. Their marriage was not immediately recognized by all institutions. The Catholic Church required a lengthy annulment from her first marriage, a process that took over 3 years, but the public cared little for technicalities. To them, she was a princess, a figure of fascination, glamour, and intrigue. The media frenzy that accompanied their union was extraordinary. Traffic outside Caxton Hall ground to a halt as crowds gathered to witness the event. Cameras flashed relentlessly, documenting every smile, every gesture, and every carefully arranged detail. Designers and seamstresses scrambled to dress Lee in a manner befitting her new status. Oleg Cassini's former assistant created a gown that exuded both elegance and subtle power, signaling that Lee belonged effortlessly in her royal narrative. Newspapers around the world published her photos, noting that while Polish titles had officially been meaningless since 1921, Lee's public persona elevated them to something spectacular, a living fairy tale in contemporary Europe. Even motherhood could not slow her momentum. Within months, Lee gave birth to her son, Anthony Radziwill, in Lausanne. The following year, she welcomed her daughter, Caroline Tina Radziwill, in New York. John F. Kennedy, then president-elect, sent a telegram celebrating the birth, remarking that the children had been born into 2 republics and 1 extinct kingdom, a line that perfectly encapsulated the strange transatlantic blend of politics, royalty, and high society in Lee's life. Yet behind the public celebrations, Lee's domestic world was carefully orchestrated. She employed multilingual nannies to care for the children while she traveled extensively between London and Manhattan. Her son would later earn a Peabody Award before succumbing to cancer at the age of 40, while her daughter remained largely private, eventually inheriting the family fortune upon Lee's death. To outsiders, she appeared the perfect mother, hosting birthday parties at Claridge's and dressing her children in designer sailor suits. Inside, however, staff referred to them as the photo op children, a reminder that Lee's public persona and private reality were always meticulously curated. Her life with the prince was a careful balance of romance, strategy, and social spectacle. Though she embraced the title and allure of royalty, Lee never relinquished her independence or her flair for social maneuvering. She hosted elegant dinners, attended exclusive events, and cultivated a network of influential friends. Across Europe and America, her home, both in London and later in New York, became a nexus of power, fashion, and cultural capital, attracting photographers, journalists, and society figures eager to glimpse the life of a modern princess. Lee's marriage to Stanislaw Radziwill was as much about personal desire as it was about public performance. She had found a partner whose life intersected with scandal, nobility, and media fascination, qualities that mirrored her own. Together they navigated the delicate interplay between private intimacy and public spectacle, ensuring that Lee remained both an object of admiration and a figure of intrigue. By the end of this chapter in her life, Lee Radziwill had fully solidified. Her reputation as a woman of beauty, influence, and social mastery. The union with Prince Radziwill was not merely a marriage, it was a carefully crafted narrative in which Lee herself was both the protagonist and the storyteller. Every glance, every outfit, and every public appearance was executed with precision, reinforcing a life that was at once scandalous, glamorous, and entirely her own. Even as Lee Radziwill flourished in European nobility, the shadow of her sister Jacqueline Kennedy loomed large. The rivalry between the sisters was as old as their childhood, rooted in competition for attention, beauty, and social recognition. While Jackie navigated the political world with elegance and poise, Lee carved her path in fashion, society, and international glamour, always aware that comparisons were inevitable. One of the most defining moments of their rivalry came in 1962, when Jackie invited Lee to join her on a diplomatic tour of India and Pakistan. For Lee, it was an opportunity not just to accompany her sister, but to make a statement of her own. Photographers documented her every move, and she transformed the traditional Indian saris she wore into haute couture evening wear, changing outfits 22 times in 9 days. By the end of the tour, the press had dubbed her the White Maharani, a testament to her effortless ability to turn every stage into a runway. Crowds in Lahore and Karachi cheered louder for Lee than they did for political dignitaries, highlighting the complex interplay between her public persona and her sister's political authority. Gifts followed her everywhere, including a horse from the President of Pakistan, reinforcing the image of Lee as a glamorous international figure, a woman whose charisma could eclipse even the most formal of occasions. Yet behind the flash bulbs and applause, Lee's motivations were carefully considered. She was never content to merely exist in someone else's shadow. She wanted her presence to command attention, to assert her individuality within a family and world obsessed with appearances. Even her children became extensions of her carefully curated image. Staff referred to them as photo-op children, a nickname that revealed the duality of Lee's life. Birthday parties at Claridge's, designer sailor suits, and perfectly posed family photographs were not just indulgences, they were strategic moves in the ongoing dance of social influence. In Lee's world, appearances were power, and every detail was a calculated statement about identity, wealth, and style. This rivalry with Jackie was never openly hostile, but it shaped Lee's public persona profoundly. The sisters' competition was a subtle battle of visibility, charm, and influence, played out on a global stage of fashion, media, and politics. Lee's charisma, her meticulous attention to dress, and her poise in public events allowed her to command attention without confrontation, ensuring that she would never be overshadowed, even by a first lady. Ultimately, Lee Radziwill's public persona was a reflection of both her innate elegance and the lessons of her upbringing. From her father's audacity to her mother's obsession with appearances, Lee learned to navigate a world where perception mattered as much as reality. She became a master of image, influence, and subtle power, a woman who could shine in the glare of international attention while maintaining the secrets and strategies that made her truly formidable. By the time Lee Radziwill approached her later years, the world had long assumed her life was one of glamour, travel, and style, but not of wealth. Society had witnessed her dazzling parties, her exquisite wardrobe, and her effortless presence on the international stage. Yet beneath the surface, Lee had quietly amassed a fortune that remained invisible to even her closest relatives. When she passed away in February 2019, many believed she had left little behind. Rumors suggested she had been selling jewelry and liquidating assets just to cover bills, a narrative that reflected both envy and assumption. But the reality was far more extraordinary. Just weeks after her death, her lawyers revealed that Lee had secretly amassed $50 million, an empire of wealth meticulously shielded from public knowledge. Her fortune was not inherited from the world or the media. It was the result of careful planning, investments, and a lifetime of discretion that mirrored the strategy she had cultivated in every social interaction. Even more remarkable than the fortune itself was what she did with it. In the months before her death, Lee had rewritten her will, choosing an heir in a move that stunned observers and underscored the long-standing family dynamics with her sister, Jacqueline Kennedy. The decision was not merely financial, it was symbolic, a final statement in a decades-long rivalry that had shaped the lives of both sisters. Lee's actions demonstrated her lifelong understanding that control and legacy were as important as wealth itself. Her children were the ultimate beneficiaries of this hidden empire. Her son, Anthony, had already passed away, leaving her daughter, Caroline Tina Radziwill, to inherit the fortune. This decision highlighted Lee's enduring focus on family strategy, ensuring that her carefully curated legacy would continue according to her design. It was a reflection of a woman who had learned early in life that appearances could be misleading and that true influence was often exercised quietly, behind the scenes. Lee's fortune was more than money. It was a culmination of a life lived,